All right. Well, I want to just, first of all, I'm Stephen Atkinson. I'm a principal planner at the City of Tacoma, and I'm the City of Tacoma's lead project manager for the Tideflats Suburban Plan. I want to just, first of all, just welcome everyone tonight to our report out on the lessons that we've learned and what we've heard from our community during our visioning phase of the suburban planning process. So through our online vision survey, as well as community outreach meetings. Really looking forward tonight to be able to report out on what we've heard from all of you and other community members that participated in that work. Before we get started, just wanted to cover a couple of other details. First of all, this evening's meeting can be heard in English or Spanish. So I think you can look at the bottom of the screen on the toolbar, and you should be able to see a globe icon on the screen and select your language of choice. And then next slide, please. Sorry, just pulling up the text. And then before we get started with the rest of the meeting, and I'll introduce Marcy Wagner, I wanted to again acknowledge the land that we are conducting this work on, and the work that we are performing is in collaboration with the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. I want to acknowledge that this project is being conducted on the historic and current homelands of the Puyallup Tribe of Indians. Since time immemorial, they have hunted, fished, and gathered in the Tacoma Tideflats, and they retain these rights to this day. Let us take this moment to recognize the unique responsibility of being co-stewards with the tribe over these lands and waters, and work with them to safeguard their treaty-protected rights. And with that land acknowledgement, I'd like to introduce Marcy Wagner, who will discuss the agenda for the evening and then kick off the rest of our presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you, Steve. Here's our agenda for this evening. As you can see, we'll be telling you more about what we've heard through the visioning process, as Steve mentioned, and that included meetings, panels, focus groups, and the survey. The project management team members are going to share some examples with you of what can be accomplished in 20-year timeframes. Then we'll provide more information about two of the topics that were of significant interest, and that interest was expressed both through the survey and through outreach. We're going to be using Zoom polls at several points in the meeting. The poll will appear on the screen, and we'll pause for a few moments for you to respond so that you can add your perspectives, and then we'll share the poll results before moving on. The project management team for the Tacoma Tideflats Subarea Plan is composed of representatives from each of 5 participating agencies and the Puyallup Tribe. Those members are Steve Atkinson, who from City of Tacoma, who you just heard from, Steve Friddle from the City of Fife, Sean Gaffney from Pierce County, Andrew Strobel from the Puyallup Tribe of Indians, and Deirdre Wilson for the Port of Tacoma. The representatives of those, Steve Atkinson, Andrew Strobel, and Deirdre Wilson, will be speaking later in the program. The consultant team presenters include myself, Deborah Munkberg, and Radhika Nair from Burke Consulting, and Paul Schlenger from ESA. If, as a quick reminder again, for those who may have just joined, if you would like to hear this presentation in Spanish, please click on the globe icon on your toolbar and click on Spanish if you would like to hear in that language. Before telling you more about what we've heard, we'd like to begin with 2 polling questions. The first, did you participate in any of the visioning activities? And secondly, where have you been learning about how to get involved in this project? Please respond with any of them that are appropriate for you. So multiple answers are good. All right. Shall we see what we have in poll responses? So great, we had participants. It looks like in all the activities to some degree. And project website seems to be a consistent one for hearing about it, as well as Facebook, friends and coworkers, and some other opportunities. So thank you for completing our poll. And now I am going to turn the meeting over to Deborah.
Oops. Hello, thanks Marcy. I'm Deborah Monkberg with Burke Consulting, and I think we want to start out by describing sort of where we are and how the visioning process fits into this project. So next slide, please. The schedule is a timeline of sort of where we've been and where we're headed. And you can see that we are here at the community meeting right now. Beginning early this year, and especially in March and April, our focus has been on community outreach and visioning. There have been a series of events, including the community kickoff, community panel discussions, focus groups, an online visioning survey, meetings in a box, and advisory group meetings. We'll be talking about all of those in just a few minutes. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about schedule here. The project team will use all of the information that's been developed through the public engagement process to help identify a draft vision statement for the plan and alternatives that will be reviewed in the Project Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS. This fall, you can expect a public scoping meeting to share information about the EIS and to hear your thoughts on the preliminary alternatives and topics to be analyzed in the EIS. And you see that as kind of the next red dot there that says EI scoping. Along with this meeting, there will also be sort of a longer comment period in which to provide written comment. Following that, later this year and into early next year, we'll be working on the draft EIS and the draft plan framework. That'll be issued sometime in early 2022, and there'll be opportunities to provide comment and input on both of those draft documents at that time. All right, so public engagement. As I mentioned, we've been focusing over the past few months on community outreach to develop a future vision. And this slide shows the major events and the number of participants we had at those. I want to describe some of those events to you in a moment, but before we do that, I just wanted to acknowledge that starting in 2020 and right up to now, we have needed to engage remotely rather than in person, and wanted to just take a minute to acknowledge that that's been difficult, and we know it's made it harder for some people to engage. We appreciate it and want to thank everyone for your patience as we've gone through this process and your willingness to sort of jump in and join the conversation in any way that you could. Also, there have been a number of people who have volunteered to hold events, and I also want to thank you for leaping into this process. It probably felt a little bit new and perhaps uncomfortable. We really appreciate everyone's participation and look forward to meeting with you in person as soon as it's safe. All right, so wanted to talk about some of these engagement types. These list the kinds of activities. Some of these are pretty self-explanatory, but I wanted to touch on a few that might not be. First one being meetings in a box. These are really smaller meetings that were held by volunteers or staff to share information about the project and to ask for thoughts about the future. Some of the groups that participated in the meetings in a box are listed on the right. We've had about 18 meetings and reached out over 250 people. You also see the reference to panels there. These were really 3 community meetings that were focused panel discussions on different aspects of the future of the tide flats. Topics addressed at each meeting were the natural environment and health, land use and the economy, and transportation and infrastructure. For each meeting, we had 3 to 4 panelists with background knowledge and expertise in these topics and the tide flats, responding to a series of questions about future opportunities and challenges facing the tide flats. These meetings were a companion piece to support the online survey, which was structured according to the same topic areas discussed in the panel discussions. And I wanted to just touch on the focus groups. These are small group meetings that were designed to provide a sort of a wide range of perspectives on the tide flats. We held 2 meetings that were conducted as facilitated discussions. Participants were a mix of representatives from local businesses, service organizations, the UW, including faculty and students, and included interests in sustainability in the environment, economic development, transportation, open space and community planning, and questions focused around what is the biggest opportunity in the tide flats and how does the tide flats look and function 20 years from now? And you can see some quotes here that are highlights of the discussion. And they really represent some of the major themes we heard from the discussion. The first one being the importance of the tide flats as an employment center. Comments you see mention that the variety of industry found in the tide flats really supports a robust economy. And also that the tide flats is an important place for employment opportunity for people who don't have a college degree. There's also recognition of the significance of the tide flats as the home of the Puyallup tribe. This is important both culturally and for the role the tribe plays as a leader in environmental protection and improvement. And then last, a theme I'd say we heard pretty consistently through the visioning process, and that's the idea that a healthy natural environment and a healthy economy in the tide flats should not be an either or question, that both are important to the community and both need to be protected and fostered into the future. All right, I think we're next to Marcy.
Thanks, Deborah. Now I'd like to share some of the results from the survey by highlighting some of the questions and responses. Here the question was, what are the biggest opportunities in the tide flats? As you can see, 50% responded that restoration and cleanup of natural areas was the biggest opportunity that they saw for the future. Also important and an opportunity was preserving and strengthening jobs. Another was transitioning away from fossil fuel facilities and then making improvements to the transportation infrastructure. All significantly important in the responses we heard. Another question was, which industrial land uses should be emphasized over the next 20 years? As you can see here, one that received the most positive responses, was green industrial uses or industrial uses that promote a more environmentally sustainable economy. Container shipping and international trade uses were recognized as important. Port maritime uses, a mix of industrial uses with a wider range of businesses and activities, including businesses that are tied to industrial processes such as design, research and development, and the fishing fleet, boat yards, and marine trade uses. The next survey question I'm going to touch on is, what are your biggest transportation concerns in the tide flats? Probably not a surprise, the traffic congestion and backups rated the highest. And that was followed by the safety concerns with trains and trucks traveling in the area. Also, the limited options for walking and the limited bridges across the Puyallup River or other waterways. And finally, what do you value most about natural resources in the tide flats? You can see with 64% of the responses protecting the natural resources rated highest, followed by serves the cultural purposes. Next, provides recreational opportunities such as fishing, walking and birding, provides fisheries, industry jobs, and traditional subsistence living, and also provides public access, water access. So from the outreach, the survey, as well as all the outreach that was done, there were some top themes that emerged that will inform the vision for the tide flats. You can see those here: environmentally sustainable world-class port, diverse employment center, home to recovering marine resources, collaboration across interests, modern infrastructure and transit, an attractive city in which to live and work, and cultural representation of the Puyallup tribe. I'd like to do another Zoom poll at this time. This one, which theme from what you've heard best represents your vision for the future of the tide flats? Please select one. So if you could go ahead and respond to the poll at this time, we'll give it a few minutes and then show the results. All right. So let's see what we have in the poll. So some similar environmentally sustainable world-class port, diverse employment center, and home to recovering marine resources. So thank you for taking the poll. And I'm now going to turn the meeting back to Deborah.
Sorry about that. I have to find my mute button every time. So we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit more about vision. And I'll just reiterate that the ideas and input that you've provided will help to inform the development of a shared long-term vision for the tide flats and for the alternative future scenarios that will be considered in the environmental review and planning work that's coming in the next phases of the project. One of the important characteristics of a vision statement is that it looks out over the long term. We're really asking, how should the tide flats look and function in 20 years? So that's roughly 2040. What should it look like? How should it work? That can feel like a long time, and knowing the uncertainty about the future, it might be hard to imagine what we could or should expect over a 20-year period. So to help give a sense of that, members of the project management team are going to give a few examples, local examples that talk about what was the vision and what did happen over time. And I think we're starting with Andrew. Yes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Strobel, Director of Planning and Land Use with the Puyallup Tribe of Indians, and I'm pleased to share this ongoing project. The Ole and Charlie's Marina was at one point in time a site partially owned by the tribe to the south and partially owned by the Port of Tacoma to the north. It's on Marine View Drive on the way to Northeast Tacoma past the Hylobos Bridge. The various actions on the site did not originate out of a single planning document. The impetus was born out of an initiative for the tribe to have its own shipping terminal originally. That agreement was not executed, but as part of it, this land was transferred to the tribe. As stated, the property was fully acquired through a transaction with the Port of Tacoma related to the tribe's terminal plans. The tribe owned the property to the north or to the south through a 99-year lease on the south side of the property, and the port transferred the remaining property to the tribe after it was cleaned up from contamination. While this is still within a 20-year planning horizon, I felt it was important to bring up that as there are future steps that still need to occur. The tribe envisions a location for active use by tribal fishermen to dock their boats, future cultural events like the annual canoe journey, and future remediation and enhancement of the tidal lands at the north side of the property. The acquisition of the old Ole and Charlie's Marina was predicated on the Port of Tacoma's first cleaning up the contamination on the site before transferring to the tribe. Creosote pilings were the foundation of most of the pier structures. There were some mysterious oil drums in and around the site that had to be removed. And the site was leveled as part of the cleanup effort. This effort was a multi-year effort. Today, the site is a really excellent example of a cleanup project, a fisheries project, a mitigation project, and a cultural project all in one. Mitigation lands were restored around 2012 to provide additional shallow water marine habitat in the Tideflats. In 2018, it was named Duf Shlala Ali Pushultsid for a place to come ashore. The site originally hosted the 2018 Power Paddle to Puyallup Canoe Journey event. We were nervous hosting this event and choosing the location. We had to do soil studies to make sure that it was an acceptable site to support the event. In 2018, additional docks were provided for tribal fishermen for temporary moorage, as there was limited access locations for them to provide their fishing boats. And the future is still being developed as we're still in the 20-year horizon. Dufshlala Ali will host future gatherings and an example of a resilient site that both supports spiritual and economic needs of the tribe for generations to come. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Deirdre Wilson. I'm the Senior Planning Manager for the Port of Tacoma. And I would like to present to you just in a couple minutes here a quick summary of a project that the Port of Tacoma has undertaken. It hasn't taken quite 20 years, but I imagine that about 20 years ago, someone was thinking about it. So this project is the General Central Peninsula on the Blair Waterway in the Tacoma Tideflats area. This is a redevelopment, remediation, and realignment of this major terminal. The project planning did begin in about 2008 and it didn't necessarily start with a planning effort, but was encapsulated into the 2012 Port of Tacoma Strategic Plan. And upon that time, the commissioners launched into and gave approval for the preliminary design work. And then that began the process of realignment, which resulted in the need to clean up some of the soil that was in the area next to the pier there. The purpose of this project was the result of larger ships in the ocean going vessels becoming larger to be more efficient moving across the ocean and carry more containers at one time. And so this is, I would say, a modernization project for the Port of Tacoma to modernize this terminal and upgrade it, and to meet those current and future market demands. The first phase of the redevelopment was initiated in 2011. And then, like I said, the authorization to do design was in 2012. So this did take many years to get to the point that it is today, which is not completely finished, but well underway. 10% of the soil that needed to be taken out to accommodate this realignment was determined to be contaminated. And there was a bottom paint that used to be used on the bottom of ships and hulls of ocean-going vessels called tributyl-10 that was found to be in the soil. And so the port was responsible for removing that material before completing the realignment of the facility. That type of paint is no longer allowed, but many years ago when it was being used, it was something that contaminated that soil there. And that frequently does happen with port projects, where once the port gets into the development, does the analysis of the soils, and it's necessary to clean up whatever contamination exists there from prior uses. The cargo capacity across the pier has been increased from about 767,000 TEUs, which is 10-foot equivalent containers, to 1.3 million TEUs. So not quite doubling, but pretty close. And at the time of this project, it was estimated that 1,519 jobs in Washington state were connected to that terminal. The total price tag for this project as of 2019, when the new cranes arrived, was about $262 million. And so that gives you some indication of the public investment that exists in the Tideflats as far as the port facilities on the waterway. This did include the upgrade of the piers, the cleanup of the soil, and the new cranes, and allowed the port to achieve this facility that now can withstand or support some of the largest vessels in the industry now, making it one of our premier facilities with the Northwest Seaport Alliance, so for both harbors. And this, like I said, this is a modernization project, so it also included electrical upgrades, which allow for shoreside power for the ships coming in, as well as stormwater upgrades and all of the other things that come along with this kind of a modernization project on a port facility. And as far as the relationship to the planning process, we just completed our most recent update to the strategic plan, but this continues to be a priority for the port and continues to be in the strategic plan to promote the cargo business and continue to be a premier facility for that in international and domestic trade.
Great, I'll jump on again. I'm Stephen Atkinson, again with the City of Tacoma. And just wanted to share a little bit of kind of an overview history of the Thea Foss Waterway, in part because I think it does offer some interesting lessons for the Tideflats subway planning process and kind of what we hope to accomplish out of it. So first of all, in the 1970s, kind of going a little step even further back in time, the city had really a lack of a publicly accessible shoreline. And with the advent of the Shoreline Management Act at the state level, and then local planning for our shorelines, the city developed first of all, a very broad vision for a more continuous shoreline trail system that would connect downtown to Point Defiance, and then south again all the way down to Day Island. So then from this broad vision, when the opportunity came along in the early 1990s, the city had already done that legwork to really have an idea of what we wanted to do, what we wanted to create a more accessible shoreline and more of a people place in the waterfront. So when that opportunity came along, we were prepared to take that step to acquire it and really seize that opportunity. So in 1991, the city of Tacoma acquired 27 acres of the West Foss. And this was at a time when a lot of industry was starting to relocate really into the heart of the Tideflats and away from the west side of the Thea Foss Waterway. So it was a period where it was in kind of a land use transition already. The city acquired that property. And some of the lessons I think really come out of this is, the city exhibited strong leadership. We talked a lot about kind of leading by example. So this was a case of leading by example to take on a proactive remediation effort. The city spent around $100 million in cleaning up the Thea Foss Waterway and repairing some of the historic contamination and that legacy of pollution in this area. But also had that vision already in place to say, what can this become? So once that cleanup has been accomplished, we're now able to turn this property into some other public benefit. And so on the left-hand side here, hopefully it's left on everyone's screens, there's an interesting graphic back when, from back when planners at the city of Tacoma still hand drew graphics for our planning documents. So this was from the 1992 Thea Foss Waterway Plan. May even have been still the city waterway in this first plan early on. But the vision here that had been created was framed around the idea of access, boating, and character. And it was, I think, some of the parallels here that make this important for consideration is that it was a plan that combined policy, it combined land use and zoning, development regulations, it combined public access and restoration, as well as a place for industry. And so it was a pretty multifaceted planning effort to really look at not just the vision, but how do we implement that in policy? How do we follow through with our development regulations? And then how are we going to invest our public dollars to really put this vision into effect? And so if you can see the full graphic someday, it actually shows things like the D Street overpass, the public promenade, shows the museums, the 509, the Murray Morgan Bridge. So many of these elements that we can see, use, enjoy today when we go down to the Thea Foss Waterway were really put on paper, ink to paper back in 1991. And then following that, the city took the lead in 1994 on the cleanup, but it did take another decade before that cleanup was completed for the Thea Foss Waterway. Personally, I started the city in 2007. And so I came in sort of a second phase, and there's another lesson here that I just wanted to share, which is over time, these planning efforts from the very first seed of the idea to the creation of this type of management plan and capital plan, all the way through to implementation, community needs, values, priorities can change over time. And so the Thea Foss Waterway vision and the planning effort that went into that was also something that adapted over time as needs changed, as priorities changed, policies changed, even science changed during the implementation of this effort. And so you can see some of those changes over time and how those have been implemented. I'd also say, I think one of the lessons here is that over time success is also contingent on things that happen outside of the planning effort. So while the Thea Foss plan has been successfully implemented and there's still work ongoing, you can also see that sometimes the success of the Thea Foss Waterway is still dependent over time on the connectivity to downtown and the things that happen around it. And so the city continued to then develop other plans for the areas to think about how we now help facilitate people getting to the waterfront to take advantage of this great location and great setting. And so that ended up being another aspect of this, that there's a branching effect of a need for new plans and new capital projects to really help activate the area and make the most of it. So I guess just kind of a couple final takeaways. Plans can change, and it's, I think, important to be adaptive over time. Not necessarily recognizing that the plan, every detail is set in stone at the outset and is unchangeable, but we need to be able to be adaptive while still maintaining some of the broad contours. In order to have successful implementation, we really need to think at the outset, like we're doing in this planning effort, about how we connect policy with development regulations, with capital dollars, and really make sure that all of our plans and programs are in sync. And I think there's an element here of patience too, and recognizing that when we have the vision, you still need those opportunities to put it into effect. And sometimes those opportunities can take a long time before they come along. And so in this case, it was over 10 years before of planning work to kind of help lay the groundwork before those big opportunities came along that the city could take advantage to really then bring this project to fruition. Hope everyone here is familiar with the Thea Foss Waterway. If not, hopefully next time you take a walk along the waterfront, you can think a little bit about that planning effort and how it pertains to this work that we're doing today.
So thank you, Steve, Deirdre, and Andrew. You heard from those presentations, actually a good wrap up that Steve did and the things that were important. But just to reiterate, they do take collaboration. It's an important aspect. They take years of effort to plan and implement the change. The vision is a big idea. And as Steve mentioned, it also needs to be adaptable and a big enough framework that it can change as need be, given the length of time involved, that it needs that kind of flexibility. And also patience in order to accomplish the big ideas. In the survey, we heard the most interest around a couple of ideas: preserving and strengthening jobs and continued restoration and cleanup of natural areas. We wanted to share some additional context about these ideas, including what opportunities we have for the future and what additional questions need to be answered to achieve the vision. After the following presentations, we'll ask you a few questions, and now Radhika will speak to preserving and strengthening jobs.
Thanks, Marcy. Hello, everyone. I'm Radhika Nair, a senior urban planner at Berg. I want to talk first about some of the history of the Port of Tacoma MIC, or the Tideflats. The Tideflats has a really rich history. It has a rich history of subsistence, of travel, trade, and economic opportunity for Native American communities. It has also played a dynamic role in the development of the city of Tacoma and ocean cargo operations in the Pacific Northwest overall. A key piece of the history that I want to highlight is how continually the area has evolved to meet the needs of the region, and this has happened since the 1800s. At the turn of the century, it was a bustling place with electric streetcars and the beginnings of one of the largest meatpacking companies on the West Coast. And in 1918, Pierce County established the Port of Tacoma, where a new publicly owned grain elevator and port cold storage facility saved the region's agricultural goods from spoiling. Activities were reprioritized during World War II, and industrial growth continued expanding in the mid-20th century. Today, the Tideflats, or the Port of Tacoma Manufacturing Industrial Center, MIC, is part of a regional ecosystem of manufacturing industrial centers. It has dynamic interactions with and impacts on a multitude of players. Reflecting its wider impact, the Tideflats is a regional job center. The map here on the slide on the right shows the home location of workers in the Tideflats, and you can see how the Tideflats draws workers from across the region. Can you go to the next slide, Rebecca? As an employment center, the activities it supports, the making and moving of things, fishing and trade, it continues to support the region and the city's economic success. There are currently over 10,000 jobs located in the Tideflats, and this represents about 10% of the total employment in the city of Tacoma. The chart on the slide shows the employment in the area by industry sector across the last 10 years. And you can see in purple there, the largest industries by employment are industrial sectors such as wholesale, trade, transportation, and utilities, the WTU in the lighter purple, which comprises about 40% of overall employment, as well as the manufacturing sector, which is in the darker purple there, which comprises about 30%. And you can also see that since 2010, the WTU sector has driven most of the employment growth, while the manufacturing sector has shrunk from about 35% in 2010 to about 26% now. Manufacturing, transportation, utility, maritime, industrial services, machinist and contractor jobs are available to workers with relatively less formal education. And compared to lower wage service sector jobs, these jobs provide a source of stable employment with opportunities for advancement. And while the area is a major regional employment center, it's also expected to grow by 2040, which would be in the next 20 years or the life of the sub-area plan. Employment in this area, the Port of Tacoma MIC, is expected to grow by almost 7,000 jobs to close to 17,000 jobs from the 2019 estimated employment of 10,000 jobs. And as the area grows, this employment growth will be influenced and shaped by several trends. There's a growing interest in environmental sustainability in industrial districts. And through engagement, community members have noted opportunities in green industrial development, reflecting that larger trend. There are other trends in sectors such as logistics, manufacturing. There are changes to shipping technology, and all of these will influence the area in the years to come. Some of these include the consolidation of manufacturing in fewer locations, which means that logistics becomes increasingly important. Technological changes such as growing containerization and automation, and some impacts on the workforce needs of industrial districts based on these trends. With that, I'm going to hand this over to Paul on our consultant team to talk a bit about the restoration and cleanup of natural areas.
Wonderful. Thank you, Radhika. Hi, I'm Paul Schlinger. I'm a fisheries biologist with Environmental Science Associates, and I'm going to talk about the Tacoma Tideflats area. Next slide, please. So the Tacoma Tideflats sub-area in Commencement Bay supports a wide diversity of fish, shellfish, and aquatic vegetation. Animals of all shapes and sizes live in these waters and use the available habitats in different ways throughout their lives. Tacoma Tideflats looks a lot different today than it did in the late 1800s. This slide shows the differences between the historic shoreline of the late 1800s and today. The historic map on the left shows a lot of curving lines, which indicate complex shoreline habitat, which is good. Also, the area in brown and green are the mudflats and wetlands that were present at the time. There were approximately 6,000 acres of mudflats and wetlands in the area. Contrast that with the present day map on the right. You can see that the shoreline has been transformed into a series of waterways with a lot of straight lines. And while not shown on the map, it's estimated that there are currently fewer than 300 acres of mudflats and salt marshes. And this represents about a 95% loss of those habitats compared to the historic amounts in the late 1800s. I want to highlight a lot of this development occurred before we were aware of and had an understanding of the environmental damage resulting from the development of the shoreline. It was a different time, and we're now much more aware of the role these habitats have for fish, shellfish, and plant communities. There has been a lot of effort by a number of groups into restoring habitats and improving conditions, and that's what this slide shows. This map shows the location of habitat restoration sites in and around the Tacoma Tideflat subarea. Sites managed by the city of Tacoma are shown in yellow circles. 2 sites restored by the Commencement Bay Natural Resource Trustees are shown with blue circles. And parcel outlines of restoration areas of the Port of Tacoma are also colored in. You'll see in green that there are several current habitat sites by the Port of Tacoma, and in yellow, they've identified several potential sites that may get restored in the next 20 years. The port has a habitat story map online, which provides information about their habitat restoration efforts. And since the 1980s, the port estimates it has constructed and preserved more than 213 acres of habitat across more than 20 sites. And while these sites are on the maps are attributed to the city or the port, it should be noted that these projects have been completed through partnerships. Also, it should be noted much of the work done at the habitat site shown on this map was done to offset impacts to habitat that occurred elsewhere to allow for shoreline development. We call these mitigation projects. This slide shows 2 examples of habitat restoration sites by the Port of Tacoma in the sub-area. On the left is a photo of the shoreline restoration project at Slip 5. Slip 5 is located on the west side of the mouth of Blair Waterway, bordering Commencement Bay. and it provides about 7 acres of habitat. The restoration provides a sand and gravel beach that provides important shallow water habitat along the shoreline. Photo on the right it shows a salt marsh restoration at place of circling waters. This is a 30-acre restoration site at the head of at the mouth of Hylobos Creek. And the marsh and channels provide ideal habitat for juvenile salmon and other species. So when we look at recent trends and what it means for the future, there's several factors that contribute to improved emphasis on habitat restoration in the Tacoma Tideflats subarea. First, in recent years, there have been strengthened environmental regulations. There are more laws that ensure shoreline habitats and resources are properly managed. A big part of this is the Federal Endangered Species Act listings of Chinook salmon, Puget Sound steelhead, and bull trout. Of these, Chinook salmon are especially dependent on the habitats in the sub-area. Third, the landowners of the area are committed to environmental stewardship. They take their responsibilities as stewards of the environment very seriously and are working to improve conditions. And fourth, there's greatly improved public awareness of environmental issues and proposed projects. There are also a lot of improved opportunities to comment. Through the dawn of the internet, it's made it a lot easier to share information, and therefore there are many more ways to get information to the public and feedback and input from the public. Looking ahead to what may be next in the next 20 years, there are opportunities for additional habitat restoration, mitigation, and stewardship. And the map shown in the earlier slide included several potential sites that provide a good starting point to think about some of the opportunities ahead. In this area, there are multiple competing interests for available land, and it's important to note that those areas where habitat is a focus are high functioning and effective. Working towards habitat sites that are larger in size and provide connected corridors will help increase the effectiveness of habitat restoration efforts. Larger areas are very important for making the restoration effective. Partnerships have been and will continue to be key to future habitat projects. It takes a lot of collaboration and creativity among partners to complete effective habitat projects in this area, so we can look forward to that. Lastly, landowners and partners are continuing to look for future opportunities to improve habitats in the project area in ways compatible with other desired uses.
So we have one final Zoom poll for you. You heard presentations about the opportunities related to employment and the economy and to continued cleanup and restoration of natural areas. Can you tell us, do you agree or disagree that these are the biggest opportunities in the Tidelands? So if you'll take a moment and respond, we'll then show the results. All right. So a significant 63% agree or strongly agree that these are important. We have some that don't agree, 26%, and 13% in the middle. So thank you for taking the time to give us your feedback in that regard. I'm now going to turn the meeting back to Steve Atkinson.
All right, great. Thank you, Marcy. So just a couple of final slides to wrap up for the evening. First of all, I just wanted to point out a few of the upcoming activities and next steps for the subrate planning project. Just wanted to make sort of a broader note here. As Deborah mentioned earlier, one of the next milestones in this process will be developing what we call, and this will sound very planner-esque, the alternatives that will go into the environmental impact statement, environmental review for the subrate plan. So just generally what that means is when we're conducting an environmental review, the purpose of that is to think about different courses of action or different decisions that we can make about an area and how that area might develop over time. And then in developing those different alternatives, those different paths that this area could take, we can then analyze what we might expect the environmental impacts to be from these different courses of action. And this is an informational tool to really help give our policymakers as good of an understanding as we can develop of what the potential impacts and implications are of alternative 1 versus alternative 2 and alternative 3 for the Tideflats area. And then that information will be used to then help develop the subrate plan and think about how we can address some of those potential impacts in our planning work. So the plan and environmental review are intended to be iterative and really work hand in hand so that we can get a good understanding of those impacts and the choices that we have in front of us, and then incorporate some of those pathways and mitigation measures into our subrate plan and development regulations at the end of that process. So, so kind of the message here is really that this visioning work will really help lay the groundwork for the themes and the concepts that go into those alternatives. So what we really hope is if you're continuing to participate in this process in the upcoming months, we'll be starting to work with the steering committee to evaluate those potential alternatives and then to get a recommendation from the steering committee ultimately on 3 alternatives that will go into that environmental review. So we hope that you will see some of the input that you've provided us in those concepts and in those alternatives that move forward. And then lastly, kind of following that, in the fall, what you'll see is then sorry for the slide. You'll see the kind of one of the next kind of major opportunities to participate in the process as well and provide additional comment will be through the scoping. And so that's a phase in this where once we have the alternatives for the environmental review, what we'll be asking you again is your thoughts, questions, concerns that you want to make sure are evaluated and considered in the environmental review that we're conducting. And then broadly, looking at 2022 to have that draft plan and draft environmental review completed. Next slide. And then just to finally wrap up for the evening, looks like we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but just wanted to say again, how much we appreciate everyone's participation, even on a beautiful day like today to come out to this meeting and be part of this. And just again, wanted to acknowledge just what a challenging year it's been. If I think back to January of last year, February, we were developing a public engagement plan, presenting to the steering committee, really with the idea that we'd be conducting these meetings in person, that we get to see you all, have conversations and a dialogue. And it's been a challenging year to have to pivot from that initial plan and concept for how we were going to be conducting this work. And so not only has the governments had to be, that are leading this had to be flexible and adaptive. We heard, very loud and clear from our steering committee that, we need to be flexible and pivot to whatever technologies are available to continue to conduct this work, that we can't put it on hold. It's too important for that. And really want to acknowledge our consultant team and our community that made that pivot and that change with us, and some of the difficulties that we've gone through and just the technological side as well. But thank you all for being on that journey with us, for kind of going through those changes with us. And as Deborah said early on, we do hope that we'll get to see you all again in person, hopefully sometime soon. And we'll continue to have conversations around then how we continue to modify our engagement depending on the context with the pandemic. So thank you all. Hope you all have a wonderful night and continue to participate and attend and provide input throughout this process. Thanks again.